Create a timeless piece you'll wear for years with a Newcomb coat from Cashmerette. This coat is fully lined with front flap pockets, bound buttonholes, an inner lining pocket, back button tab, and a practical inner hanging loop. It's an impressive design and a chic showstopper. Let's sew it together now from start to finish. Before you begin construction, interface your fabric pieces as indicated in the pattern instructions. Apply weft interfacing to 2 front pieces, 2 pocket flaps, 2 undercollars, 2 belts, 1 buttonhole welts, 2 back hem interfacings along 2 back edges, and 2 sleeve hem interfacings along 2 sleeve edges. Then apply knit interfacing to 1 upper collar, 2 collar stands, 2 front facings, 1 back facing, and 1 inner pocket facing along the tops of your inner pocket bags. Here are both of my front pieces, and I'm going to stay stitch the neckline from the shoulder to the center front with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat to stay stitch the neckline of the back pieces as well, from the shoulder to the center back. Place one of your interfaced pocket flap pieces right sides together with one of the uninterfaced pocket flaps, and pin around the curved edges. Sew from the straight edge and around the curved edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim those seam allowances to 1/8 of an inch. Turn the pocket flaps right side out and give them a good press. Then we'll top stitch around those sewn edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've transferred my pocket placement marking onto the wrong side of my front pattern piece. Now I'm going to draw a line down the center of this rectangle. I'll do the same on the front of this piece. Now I'll place the interfaced side of my pocket flap right sides together with the front bodice so that the raw edges of the flap are right in line with the center line that I just drew. The top curved edge of your flap should be oriented toward the top of the garment. Now we'll sew the pocket flap in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, stopping precisely at both finished edges of the flap. Here is my lower pocket facing piece, and I've transferred the dots from the pattern piece onto the wrong side. Now I'll place this lower pocket facing right sides together with the front bodice, aligning the slanted raw edge with the center line that I drew onto the bodice. Making sure that the dots align with the outer edges of the rectangle. Note that the longer side of your lower pocket facing is facing the center front. Now we'll sew this pocket facing in place from dot to dot, backstitching at both dots. Here is my upper pocket facing piece, and I've transferred the dots along the upper edges from the pattern piece. I'll align the slanted edge of the upper pocket facing with that center line on the front bodice so that those slanted edges butt right up against the slanted edges of the lower pocket facing. And we're going to sew from dot to dot in the same way with the same 1/4 inch seam allowance, backstitching at both dots. Now that both of the pocket facings are attached, we're going to slash through the center of that pocket opening, cutting right along that center line that we drew onto the front bodice piece earlier. We're going to start our slash a 1/2 of an inch away from the edge of that rectangle and stop a 1/2 of an inch away from the rectangle on the other side. Once you've clipped to a 1/2 of an inch away from the edge of the rectangle, we're going to clip to the corners of the rectangle, careful not to clip through the stitching. Doing this on both sides. Now we can push our pocket facings to the inside through the cutting line. Give everything a good press. As you do, your pocket flap will be oriented toward the bottom of the coat, and both straight edge of your pocket facings will also be oriented downward. Now we'll temporarily move the upper pocket facing out of the way, as well as the pocket flap, opening it upward. Then we're going to edge stitch along the bottom of our pocket opening with the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're sewing through the main front jacket material, as well as the lower pocket facing underneath. Open out your facings away from each other once again, and place your outer pocket bag right sides together with the bottom edge of the lower pocket facing. And pin in place. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press that seam allowance toward the outer pocket bag. Now place the opposite straight edge of the outer pocket bag right sides together with the upper pocket facing, aligning the straight edges. And pin. Sew together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press those seam allowances once again toward the outer pocket bag. We're going to fold back one of the side edges of the main bodice piece so that we have full access to the outer seam of the upper and lower pocket facing as well as the pocket bag. You'll notice that at the side of the pocket opening window, you have a tiny triangle of fabric from where we clip to those outer corners. We're going to add this tiny triangle to the pinning as we pin one of the sides shut. Sew this one side of that inner pocket from top to bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure that at the top you are adding that triangle to your stitches. Repeat with the other side of the pocket unit. Sewing this inner pocket together only, including that top triangle. Now with our pocket flap covering the opening and pressed down toward the bottom of the garment, we're going to top stitch just above that pocket flap seam with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Alternatively, you could stitch in the ditch of the seam from one side to the other. Repeat to create both of your front pockets. I've gone ahead and transferred each of the buttonhole locations from my pattern piece onto the right side of the fabric for the right front bodice piece as worn. Now I'm going to draw a rectangle around each buttonhole marking, centering it around that circle to measure 1 inch by 1/2 inch. Here's my interfaced buttonhole welt piece, and I'm going to cut it into 12 1-inch long pieces. Now we're going to fold each of these rectangles wrong sides together to form 12 welt strips. Now at each of my buttonhole markings, I'll take 2 of my welt pieces and place them right sides together with the bodice, butting those raw edges up against each other and centering them in place over the buttonhole marking. At this point, it helps to redraw your buttonhole marking on top of these welt pieces, and you can pin that in place on top of the buttonhole marking. Now I'm going to sew from edge to edge along the top and bottom horizontal lines, which should be 1/4 of an inch away from that center on both sides, starting and stopping precisely on the outer edges of this rectangle. Now we're going to cut through the center of the buttonhole in the same way as we did for the main front pockets earlier, cutting through the center, starting and stopping about 1/4 of an inch away from both ends of the rectangle. Then we'll clip diagonally to each of the outer points of the rectangle. Now we can push our welt strips through the opening to the wrong side of the garment and give that a good press. Now here is the inside of my buttonhole. To reinforce each of the outer edges of the buttonhole, we're going to sew the sides to the triangle underneath. Just as for the sides of the main front pockets earlier, we're going to move back that bodice fabric so that we can sew the sides of the welt pocket to the tiny triangles on either side of the welt buttonhole. Just sewing in a straight line, catching that triangle. Do this on both sides of the welt opening. Repeat the same exact process to form the rest of your buttonhole openings. So here are those tiny little double welts on the front side and on the inside of the front bodice piece. Here are the wrong sides of both of my front bodice pieces, and I'm going to pin my darts. Now I'll sew my darts from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so I can tie them in knots. I'm going to be pressing my darts downward after I sew them. If you have a larger bust, you can also choose to press them upward. Here is the right side of my right back piece as worn. I'm going to fold up the bottom hem along the vent extension by 1.5 inches. And I'll sew that bottom edge vertically along the bottom of the vent extension with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we can trim the bottom corner of that seam allowance. Turn this section to the wrong side, and we'll press up the rest of that hem, as well as pressing that vertical edge of the vent extension to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Here is the wrong side of my left back bodice piece as worn. In the same way as we did for the right back bodice piece, we're going to fold back this vertical edge of the vent extension to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Once that edge is pressed in place, we'll fold back the entire vent extension along the bottom notch to the right side, and we'll pin that bottom edge. Sew horizontally here along the bottom edge of the vent extension with a 1.5 inch seam allowance. Now we'll trim this bottom corner and then turn this section to the wrong side. And then give those edges a press. Place your back bodice pieces right sides together. Pin together from the top of that back bodice seam down the center back and across the top edges of the vent. And we're leaving those pressed vertical edges of the vent in place. You should have a dot transferred from your pattern piece indicating the pivoting point as we stitch this section. We're going to sew straight down from the top with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, pivoting at the dot to continue sewing the top of the vent over those pressed portions. Here is that pivot point in our stitching, and we're going to clip through the seam allowance to the point, careful not to clip through the stitching. Then we'll open up the back pieces away from each other, and we'll press this seam allowance open and press the vent extension to the left back bodice piece as worn. Now we're going to top stitch the top edge of the vent from the right side of the fabric. Feeling underneath the fabric so that you can feel the top edge of that vent, we're going to sew from the center back seam to the edge of that vent with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And if you like, you can draw yourself a stitching line on the outside of the garment. Now we can sew the front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams. Placing the front and back pieces right sides together and pinning in place. Then sew the shoulder seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now we'll place the front and back pieces right sides together once again, aligning and pinning the side seams. Sew the side seams on both sides with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Here are the wrong sides of both of my sleeves, and I'm going to pin the sleeve darts. Sew both of the darts in place in the same way as we did for the front bodice darts, from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at each point so you can tie them in knots. Then press them down toward the bottom of the sleeve. Then we'll fold these sleeves in half, right sides together, matching the notch on one side with the elbow dart, and pin in place from top to bottom. Sew these underarm seams with a 1/2-inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Along the bottoms of both of your sleeves, press the hem to the wrong side by 1.5 inches, just to form a memory crease along the bottoms. Along the top of the sleeve, we're going to sew basting stitches from outer notch to outer notch so that we can ease in the sleeve cap into the armhole. Make sure to leave tails of thread on both sides so you have threads to pull for easing. Do this for both sleeves. I'm going to turn my sleeve right side out, and I'll place it right sides together with the corresponding armhole. Match the underarm seams and the notches and pin in place. Then we can pull the basting stitches to ease the rest of the sleeve material into the arm side. Note that as we pull those basting stitches, we're not trying to form gathers here, we're simply trying to fit the material in place, so that when we sew there are no ripples at the seam line. Once it's eased in, pin in place. Sew the sleeve in place with a 1/2-inch seam allowance and press the seam allowance toward the sleeve. Repeat to insert both sleeves. I've inserted both sleeves. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowance at the bottom of the arm side. We're going to trim the lower portion of the seam allowance from notch to notch, just trimming it in half. Repeat for both sleeves. Now we're going to add shoulder pads at both of the shoulder seams. I'll place the straight edge of my shoulder pad along the seam allowance at the top of the sleeve, so that the center of the shoulder pad is centered at the shoulder seam allowance, and the straight edge meets up exactly with the raw edges of the sleeve. Now I'll sew through the shoulder pad, attaching it to the seam allowances at the shoulder. We're just using a needle and thread for this process. Attaching that center of the shoulder pad to both sides of the shoulder seam allowances, careful not to sew through the front of the garment. Once the center of the shoulder pad is secured, secure the straight edge of the shoulder pad to the sleeve seam allowance, just using a running stitch. And repeat this process on both sides. Place your two undercollar pieces right sides together along the short edge, and sew this seam with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Once that's sewn, trim the seam allowance in half and then press the seam allowance open. Place one of your interfaced collar stand pieces right sides together with this interfaced undercollar, aligning the center backs and the dots transferred from your pattern piece, and pin in place. Sew this collar stand in place from outer edge to outer edge. Now we'll trim this seam allowance in half and press the seam allowance open. Repeat to attach your remaining collar stand to the upper collar piece. Place your upper and under collar pieces right sides together and pin along the outer curved edges. Sew the outer curved edge with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Trim the seam that we just sewed to 1/8 of an inch. Turn the collar right side out and give everything a good press. Then we'll top stitch around those sewn edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here's the neckline of my coat opened out flat. With the undercollar right sides together with the neckline, we're going to pin the collar to the neckline matching the notches. Baste the collar to the neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here are my interfaced front and back facing pieces. I'm going to place them right sides together at the shoulders. Sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. To create a hanging loop for the inside back of the coat, cut a piece of twill tape 4 inches long. Then with the twill tape right sides together with the inner edge of the back facing at the center, we'll turn those short edges of the twill tape to form a loop and place each of the short edges 3/4 of an inch away from the center of the back facing. Then we'll baste those top edges in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to attach the facing to the coat. Place the facing and the coat right sides together and pin along the outer, the top, and the opposite outer edge. We're going to be sewing the facing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to start our stitching a 1/2 inch in from the inside of the facing. I've marked a dot at that 1/2 inch point as my beginning stitching guide. I'm going to start at that point, sewing along that bottom edge of the facing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then pivot to complete the rest of that stitching around the neckline and back down the opposite straight edge of that facing. And we'll stop our stitching in the same way as we started, a 1/2 inch away from the bottom edge of that facing. I'm going to clip through the seam allowance to the dot that I marked to indicate the starting points of my stitching, being careful not to clip through my stitching. Now I'm going to trim those bottom corners of the seam allowance, as well as the upper corners. And grade the seam allowances along the center fronts and the neckline. And turn the facing to the inside and poke out our corners. And then give all of those facing edges a good press. To complete the bound buttonholes, we want to transfer these rectangles to the front facing, so that when we button through this front facing as well. For each of these rectangles, we're going to use pins to mark each of the 4 corners. And you can also use pins here to secure the seam so everything is lined up underneath. Now that I've poked pins through each of the 4 corners of the rectangle, I'm going to mark those corners onto the front facing, using those pins that are extending through the front facing fabric to mark that rectangle on the front facing side. Now that I have that rectangle marked on the right side of my front facing piece, I'm going to draw a line down the center and diagonal lines connecting to each corner. Then I'll slash through those marked lines, slashing through the front facing material only. So now we have a hole in the front facing that corresponds with a buttonhole underneath. And we'll press all of that slashed material to the inside along the main rectangle lines. Now here is the rectangle formed into the front facing with the slashed material pressed to the inside. Using a needle and thread, we're going to slip stitch around the perimeter of the rectangle, securing the perimeter of this rectangle to the welt pieces underneath. Careful not to sew through the front of the garment. And do that slashing and slip stitching for each bound buttonhole. From the right side of the garment, we're going to top stitch the center front and the back neckline. Starting from the bottom edge of one center front all the way up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, around the back neckline underneath that collar seam, and then back down the opposite center front. Here are the right sides of my front lining piece and my inner pocket bag. I'm going to be adding one inner pocket, and I've transferred the rectangles to the top of my inner pocket bag, as well as to my front lining piece on the right and wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to place my inner pocket bag right sides together with the front lining piece aligning these rectangles. And I'll pin in place. Then I'll sew along my transferred rectangle with a short straight stitch. Slash through the center of the pocket opening between your stitching lines, stopping 1/2 inch away from the edge of the rectangle on both sides. Then we'll snip diagonally to the corners of the rectangle. As you snip diagonally into those corners, be careful not to clip through your stitching. Now we can push our inner pocket bag material through the cutting line, and then give your opening a good press. Now working from the wrong side of the fabric, fold your pocket bag upward to reveal the bottommost seam allowance and press that seam allowance open. Then we'll fold this inner pocket bag back downward along the fold line transferred from your pattern piece, which should be the very bottom edge of your interfacing. And give that fold line a good press. Pressing the pocket bag along that fold line allows for a lip of fabric to cover the opening. Now I'll turn my material to the right side, stitch in the ditch along this bottom seam from one end of the rectangle to the other. We're going to turn back one side of this front lining piece to expose the short edge of that inner pocket bag and the tiny triangle underneath. We're going to sew as close to the existing stitching along that tiny triangle as possible, sewing the triangle to that inner pocket bag material. Do the same on both sides. Fold the inner pocket bag so that it's right sides together with itself. Align the upper and side edges and pin in place. Sew these 3 edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, sewing at one bottom edge of the inner pocket bag and ending at the bottom opposite edge. Make sure you're sewing through the pocket material only and not through the front of the lining. Press that pocket bag flat. Then we'll turn this front lining piece to the right side once again And we're going to top stitch along the top edge of the window opening, making sure as we stitch not to catch the upper edge of the welt. I've transferred the dart marking onto the wrong side of my front lining piece and I'll pin it in place. Sew the darts in place from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so you can tie them in knots. Repeat for the darts for both front lining pieces. Then you can press your dart downward or upward if you have a larger bust. Here is the wrong side of my left back lining piece as worn. I've transferred the trimming line from the pattern piece onto the back vent. And I'm going to trim that material away. Again, we're doing this for the left back piece as worn only. Now for both of the back lining pieces, we're going to reinforce the inner corners. Starting about an inch away from the inner corner, we're going to sew with a scant 1/2 inch seam allowance, pivoting at that inner corner and sewing an inch away on the other side. Do this to reinforce both inner corners. At each of the inner corners, snip up to but not through the stitching. For the left back lining piece, we're going to press back the top and side seam allowances to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. And then for this right back piece, we'll fold back the side edge to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Place the back lining pieces right sides together along the center back. Pin the center back seam from the top and just over that folded back top layer on the back lining piece. Then we'll sew from the top as pinned with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, ending our stitching at the bottom of that folded back area at the top of that vent piece. Press the seam allowances and this top pleat toward the left side as worn. Then working from the right side, we'll once again make sure that the fabric underneath is pressed toward the left side as worn, and we'll align the notches and pin together along the top edge. Then baste that pleat in place. Place the front and back lining pieces right sides together and pin together the side seams and the shoulder seams. Sew the side seam and the shoulder seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, press the seams open, and repeat to attach your opposite front lining piece to the back lining piece on the opposite side. Here are the wrong sides of both of my sleeve lining pieces, and I'm going to pin my darts. Sew both of your sleeve darts in the same way as we did for all of our front darts and then press them downward. Fold the sleeves right sides together and pin the underarm seams. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, press the seam open and repeat for your opposite sleeve. We're going to attach the lining sleeves to the main lining pieces in the same way as we attached the sleeves to the main garment earlier. I've gone ahead and sewn basting stitches around the outer edge from outer notch to outer notch, and we'll use these basting stitches to ease the sleeve into its corresponding armhole, placing them right sides together. Once the sleeve is pinned in place, sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press that seam allowance toward the sleeve. Repeat to attach your remaining sleeve on the other side. Here are the bottom-most edges of my shell coat piece. I'm going to press these bottom edges to the wrong side by 1.5 inches all the way across, just to form a memory crease. Here's the right side of my coat. I'm going to reach underneath and grab the raw edges of the inner facing. Now that we have access to the raw edges of the inner facing, we're going to place our lining right sides together with this facing. Now we'll pin together matching the center backs and the shoulder seams. Now that I have the lining pinned along that back facing, I'll also pin along the inside edges. We're going to sew all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, attaching the lining to the facing. We're going to start our stitching 2 inches from the bottom edge of the facing, and I've placed a pin at that point. I'm going to do the same on the other side, which will be our stopping point. Make sure to backstitch at the start and stop of your stitches. Clip into the seam allowances around the curved areas. Then we'll turn the coat right side out. And we'll press our seam allowances toward the lining. Now I'm going to push my lining sleeves inside the coat. Doing this for both lining sleeves. I'll also push the sleeves of the main coat inside as well. Reach in through the open bottom of the jacket between the lining and the main coat so that we have access to the bottom of the sleeve for the main and lining pieces. Make sure that the underarm seams of the lining and the main coat are symmetrical. Once I'm sure the underarm seams are aligned, I'll align the raw edges of the bottoms of the sleeve for the main and lining pieces. And I'll safety pin those raw edges together. Then I'll slide the bottom of my main coat sleeve, which has the hem still pressed to the wrong side as we did earlier. I'll slide it into the bottom of the lining sleeve. Now we have the raw edges along the bottoms aligned all the way around. Pin in place. I'll repeat that entire process to pin the bottoms of the sleeves together on the opposite side. Sew the lining and main sleeve edges together all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure you're sewing only through these 2 layers. Fold the main sleeve hem back up along the pre-pressed crease. Add the hem seam allowance, use a needle and thread to tack that hem to the seam allowance on either side. And do the same for the bottoms of both sleeves. Push the sleeve through the main coat armhole through the gap in the bottom of the coat. Turn your coat inside out once again and align the bottom edges of the lining and the main coat. Here are the bottom edges of 1/2 of the bottom of the coat from one end to the back vent. I'm going to align the seams and pin in place. I'll continue pinning these raw edges together to about 3 inches away from the back vent. And I've placed a pin here to indicate that 3-inch distance. Then I'll continue pinning the second half of this portion. Pinning those raw edges together to the edge of the facing. I'll repeat for the second half of the bottom of the coat. Aligning the seams on the other side. Pinning to about 3 inches from the back vent. And then continuing to pin to the edge of the lining. Note that you will be pulling that lining material down to meet the bottom of the coat material, so that those bottom raw edges can be aligned. Now we're going to sew both of these bottom sections, starting at one bottom outer edge of the lining, and I'll sew to that pin that indicates the 3 inches from the back vent. Backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitches, and repeat for the second half of the bottom of the coat. Here is one bottom inner edge of the inside of the coat. With the lining facing up, fold the seam allowance between the front facing and the front lining toward the front facing and fold the hem extension up. Tucking the front lining behind the hem extension and aligning the raw edges of the seam allowances until the hem extension sits neatly with the clipped point at the lower corner. You will have a sandwich of material that looks like this. Once everything is nicely pivoted and laying flat, clip it in place. Sew the gap in the seam shut. Before I turn the coat right side out, I want to secure the underarm seam of the lining and the coat. I've cut a piece of 3-inch long twill tape. And here are the underarm points of the coat and the lining. I'm going to sew one short end of the twill tape to the underarm seam of the lining. And I'll sew the opposite short end of the twill tape to the underarm seam of the main coat, just attaching this twill tape to the seam allowances. This chain of material will help keep the lining from moving around too much within the coat. Repeat for the other side of the coat. Here is the bottommost edge of my coat on the inside. Just as we did for the bottom seam allowances of the sleeves, we want to secure the bottom folds of the jacket to the seam allowances at both side seams. Fold up the pre-pressed crease along the bottom of the coat and secure the bottom raw edge of that hem to the seam allowances on both sides. And repeat for both side seams. Now I'll turn my coat right side out. Now to attach the bottom lining to the bottom of the coat, we're going to fold back the seam allowances of the lining in this unsewn portion until they meet the finished edge of the vent on both sides, just pressing that 1/2-inch seam allowance under. Then we'll hand stitch it in place to the bottom of the coat, careful not to sew through the outermost layer. And repeat on the other side. Now we'll sew these inner pre-pressed edges of the facing along the pre-pressed edges of the coat, lining up those finished edges and slip stitching in place. Repeat this process to finish the inner edges of the outer and inner vent. Now that I have the bottom and the side edges of the vent finished, and slip stitch this top slanted opening closed. I've marked my button placement onto the left front coat piece across from each buttonhole. Now I'll sew each of my buttons in place. And we're sewing through all front layers here. Place the two belt pieces right sides together and pin around the entire perimeter. Sew all the way around with a 1/2-inch seam allowance, leaving a 1.5-inch gap for turning. Trim these seam allowances to 1/8 of an inch everywhere except for this gap. Turn the belt right side out and give it a good press. With those seam allowances turned to the inside at the opening, top stitch all the way around with the 1/4-inch seam allowance. Sew your buttonholes at the markings from the pattern piece. Sew your buttons to the back of the coat at the markings transferred from the pattern piece. And we're sewing these buttons through the outer layer of the coat only. And now your coat is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.